The fascinating thing about carbon credits is that this market, it wouldn't exist if all of us together would say it doesn't need to exist. It's like a whole construct in itself. I mean, it's literally a market that trades air.
Follow the money.
This is the podcast of the European investigative newsroom Follow the Money. I'm your host, Emma de Chatinier, recording from Brussels, and as usual, I'm joined by Follow the Money reporter and my co-host Alexander Fante in Vienna. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning, Emma.
For years, companies and policymakers have relied on carbon offsets as a way to meet climate targets. Carbon offsets are essentially certificates that prove that when a company emits CO2 by, for example, producing a car, it compensates for that by planting a tree in, say, Indonesia. This way, the CO2 is taken out of the air, and on paper, the climate impact is neutralized. But the reality is a lot less rosy than that story suggests. Follow the Money journalists Mira and Gijzel have been investigating this system for years, and they found that in reality, it's a system that's rather inefficient and quite dark. And yet, companies make hundreds of millions of euros in it. Welkom, Tis en Mira.
Hi.
Well, and before we dive into the depth of your research, maybe good to really understand what carbon credits are exactly.
Yeah, so carbon credits are actually paper certificates that prove that a ton of CO2 emissions has been either avoided or removed from the air. So you've got the emissions from, for example, your chimney as a factory, and those emissions can be, as you said, compensated by planting a tree somewhere else, and the tree absorbs kind of the CO2 emissions again.
So the company compensates its emissions by planting a new forest elsewhere. Sounds like a good trade-off.
Yeah, you would say that, but most of these carbon credits are not doing what they promise. But even then, you could still say like, yeah, but at least like something is happening, you know, it's maybe not 10 trees, but maybe one. But what we also see is that there's also damage done sometimes, like extra damage even.
Yeah, that's what the two of you explored extensively in a book that you wrote together in Dutch, but also in English. You have written many articles on this topic. And how did you first start looking into this topic? What was your first article about?
Yeah, I think we started about 3 years ago. We received an anonymous tip here at the office, a package basically. We called it the Christmas package because it had like a hidden USB in there with like a very sensitive recording of a crisis meeting of one of the biggest carbon traders in the world. And in this case, it was a Swiss company with the name South Pole. It was named after the South Pole, and like the logo was like the emperor penguin from Antarctica, and like employees were called penguins as well. And they were like in this crisis meeting because something had gone really wrong at the company, and employees were asking questions like, are the emission reduction certificates or the carbon credits that we're selling, are they actually doing what we say they are doing?
And what was the answer to that question?
I think, the short conclusion would be no, it doesn't work as promised, at least, because what you see is that most of the carbon credits that are being sold in the world, 84% of these credits don't do what they promise, which is actually, kind of a shocking conclusion because there's so much money going around. That's also, I think, something people often don't know about carbon credits. It's like a thing you maybe know from when you take a plane and they ask you, do you want to plant a tree for the environment? It sounds very nice, but people don't know that there's like this whole big world behind it, and that there's a lot of money as well. So that this whole world is kind of based on promises instead of like scientific evidence.
So what have you found that people don't understand about carbon credits? Does the system pay to pollute really work in practice, or does it rather create perverse incentives?
For sure, yeah. So for example, you're a person who owns a big chunk of land and you want to sell the carbon credits from that land. You have trees and you think, oh, these trees take CO2 out of the air. So maybe I have now, I don't know, 25 tons, let's say, that I take out of the air with my trees. Then I have 25 carbon credits that I can sell. But maybe you want to sell 30 carbon credits because yeah, you make money, and like maybe you can sort of calculate a little bit differently, and then you have more. So that's also a very clear incentive in the market, that if you are a project developer and you want to sell these carbon credits, you always want more and not less.
The fascinating thing about carbon credits is that this market, it wouldn't exist if all of us together would say it doesn't need to exist. It's like a whole construct in itself. I mean, it's literally a market that trades air. It's
Yeah, it's really hot air.
in
Yeah.
this case, it's hot air, right? Like it's because in most cases doesn't do what it promises it does. But I mean, carbon in itself has no value. It's only because we are in a climate crisis and that we say like we are emitting too much and we've got too much of that stuff in the air. And we need a market, basically. We have decided as a society that we need a market to help us get rid of that pollution in the air.
But from the side of the buyer, so we discussed before, this is a voluntary systems. Companies don't have to buy these carbon credits. So what's the reason for companies to participate in this scheme?
What we've seen is from the start, like even 30 years ago, there were Dutch companies, the electricity companies, who wanted to compensate for a coal plant that they were constructing. And already then, we actually spoke to some of the people who came up with the idea. And the idea was invented because they wanted to sort of show the government that they were already doing good things for the environment to avoid stricter regulation, basically.
And in theory, the idea of companies voluntarily offsetting could also be seen as a positive thing, right? Because it's voluntary, it's not regulated, so they're doing more than is expected of them. But at the same time, what you also see is that it gives the signals that they have things under control. And if you look at like company reports and in the finance world, if you follow all those like kind of sustainability reports there, you get really the impression that the finance sector and companies are actually doing really well. They're recovering huge areas of rainforests globally, and they're restoring wetlands, and they're protecting very special biodiversity hotspots. And when you read all that, you think like, okay, I mean, great. I mean, better that they do that than nothing, right? But then if you look at the actual numbers, I think the UN Environmental Program published a report last week. And one of their findings is that we spend 30 times more money on destroying nature than on recovering it. So balance is completely off. So it's like the offsetting industry, they really give the impression that they're recovering and restoring the nature, and that we can continue business as usual.
So that's how a company like Shell gets to feel good about itself. So it does this massive polluting, but then it says, oh, but we're protecting a piece of land abroad, and therefore we have compensated our CO2 emission.
Yeah, that's one way. Yeah.
And who ends up carrying the burdens of this system?
Nature, I think, is maybe the first one because the promise is that nature will be restored. But of course, it's not always the case. But the second one, I think, is very often the indigenous communities, because there's also a very big neo-colonial part of it that we also saw in our research. These indigenous communities very often are asked to leave certain parts of land, or to at least adapt their lifestyles because of the protection of nature. What happens is that people just go to Brazil, for example, take a piece of land and say, now it's mine. And now all the like local communities who maybe need these forests for livelihood, they have to stay out because it's protected. But then at the same time, it's not them who in general have like polluted or like destroyed these parts of nature. So yeah.
And what's like the most absurd project that you came across in your research?
So there's like biodiversity offsets as well. So you can say that you restore a population of animals, a habitat of animals in a certain area. If you, for example, destroyed a habitat somewhere else. So we came across koala credits, for example, in Australia. And then we even came across things like breastfeeding credits and plastic
What does that
credits,
mean,
right?
breastfeeding credits?
Well, breastfeeding credits is kind of like, of course, our dairy industry is emitting a lot of carbon and methane, for example. So breastfeeding credits are basically saying we're going to encourage women to breastfeed, which is causing less emissions than consuming milk from cows, right? So it's kind of a weird way of like changing people's behavior so that you can kind of create a narrative. It's like this story that you can put on a carbon certificate or a carbon credit, is that you did a certain project or undertook a certain action that kind of avoids carbon emissions. And that's how we can kind of offset emissions from fossil fuels. And this is creating a link between two activities, for example, your flight and the way somebody farms, that are very different, but it's assuming an equivalence.
But what I also sort of hear in your answers is that it's quite easy to do something that you were sort of going to do anyways, then pretend like you weren't going to do it anyways and attach a price tag to it, right?
Yeah. So like in 2023, we visited a carbon conference in London in this very fancy hotel in the center of London. And everybody was like walking around business casual. You had this women in carbon coffee bar and like all this networking opportunities. And at some point there was like a session with the Minister of Environment from Suriname. So Suriname is one of the most forested countries globally. It's one of the few countries, I think one of the three, that still captures more carbon than that it emits. So it's actually kind of an example we should very much cherish. But then the minister he was not physically there, but he was calling in on a Zoom. And he was saying like, yeah, um, if you really want to support us as like this carbon positive country, so we capture more carbon than we emit, um, we do need some money for that, because otherwise we're just going to go for new oil drilling and our gold mines, and that forest is going to disappear, and then we need to be paid. And I was like, one part of me was like, oh, that's reasonable. He's doing this, he's maybe protecting this forest and it's great, but he also needs to be encouraged to do that. But at the same time, it also sounded like he was taking, his forest almost as a hostage and putting a gun to the forest. It's like, if you don't pay me for this, you're gonna see the consequences. And in a way, when we look deeper into this, we also saw that like the forest was not actively being protected. He was giving out all these permits as well, still for gold mining and for wood to be cut. And he just wanted an extra revenue model for not doing basically what you said, Emma, for not doing anything additional, right?
But that does make me wonder, because we were talking about neocolonialism earlier. Isn't it also sort of fair from a country like Suriname to say, well, you guys have been polluting, you have all these CO2 emissions, our country is actually, like, at the end of the day, not polluting? Isn't that also sort of fair then to ask for money from other countries to protect the forest?
Yeah, in a way, you would say yes, but we could also say it's fair if we try to do more here because we emit more. So yeah, it's an interesting way to look at it, but I think it's also a bit problematic. In Suriname, for example, there was also these indigenous communities who were really not happy with these plans, with these carbon credit plans, because they also were afraid it would interfere with their lifestyle and their the way they relate to nature as well.
So basically, it's not just a matter of dynamic between global north and global south, but also within a global south country between government
For
and
sure.
indigenous communities.
For sure.
And the core here is as well with like, it's like a false equivalence again, because like nobody should be against Suriname receiving money for nature restoration. I mean, I will be very happy if countries that deal well with nature and have a lot of nature would receive more money. But the thing is that the carbon market says if we give them money, we can get something in return. And that's false, right? So my action as a Dutch person in the Netherlands is not equivalent to the action of forest protection in Suriname. I can actually, and actually, if you look at the numbers, we are polluting and destroying a lot more as a that kind of global economy than that we're restoring. So if you really want to permanently compensate fossil fuel emissions, you need to do a project that that captures carbon from the air and stores it for at least 1,000 years. Well, if you're a business and you're selling carbon credits, how can you ever promise that you will protect the forest for 1,000 years, or that you will put the carbon into the soil and as a carbon farmer, for example, and that the next 1,000 years, the farmers that will plow the land and kind of work on the land will treat the soil in the same respectful way as you do, or that the government policy doesn't change, or that there will be no drought or flooding that will kind of change the characteristics of the soil, right? It's a very false and tricky thing to sell. And the very big problem here is nobody's accountable for when it doesn't work. So all those companies we were talking about, they're all pointing fingers at each other in the industry, and nobody takes responsibility.
But if this system has been around for 30 years, how is that possible that there's no sort of regulatory framework that actually works?
Yeah, it is voluntary. So that's the point. It's not
Yeah.
regulatory. So there, of course, there are checks and balances from market players. There are like certain parties like Vera and Gold Standard. They sort of check independently as they claim, but they're still paid by the project developers who want them to be.
So these are companies that, in theory, check if the projects are real and do what they promise.
Exactly. Yes, but they're paid by the ones who want to be checked. So they're not really, in that sense, not independent. And what we also seen very often is that it's how do you say it? They're very nice in their checks and in their verification. They're not really like tough and going like, oh, this is wrong, so now this project has to stop.
And so, apart from these kind of dubious profit-driven schemes, have you also come across, kind of instances of outright fraud? I mean, is that something that is happening as well?
Yeah, so like we talked in the beginning about this secret information received from the biggest trader in the world, South Pole, and they had like a flagship project in Zimbabwe, where they were protecting like a forest area the size of Puerto Rico, and you must imagine it's like more like savanna land. It's there's some trees and some grass, and then again some trees. It's not like a jungle or something. But there's also a lot of wild animals there, so like lions or crocodiles in the water or hippos, etc. And so they were claiming this was not just a forest protection project, but also biodiversity hotspot. And there used to be a lot of trophy hunting in the area where rich tourists from the US or Germany or Switzerland would come fly in, basically shoot their elephant or their lion and take it back home as a souvenir. So it sounded like a good thing, right? But then we found that the money trail stopped at a tax haven. So like instead of the promise, so these project developers had traveled around these villages in Zimbabwe and they were showing them kind of like drawings, even comic like drawings with like, this project is going to give you money trees and you're going to get dollars and like even trees in the shapes of dollars, right? So they were promised a significant part of this 100 million euros. So you would say communities could really benefit from this. But then all those money ended up going to a tax haven in Guernsey. And the owner of this company that the money went to, which was also the project developer and the partner of South Pole, couldn't show us where that money after the tax haven was going to. So he couldn't show us the receipts or like the bank statements that could kind of support his claims that the community benefited. So that's one of the things. I don't know if you could call it fraud, but you can, of course, call it very unethical and lying, outright lying. The second problem we found was that they overestimated more than 60% of the credits. So they say they were protecting the forest, but the forest didn't need as much of protection. So they basically created a narrative that the locals were very angry people chopping down trees for their agriculture. But people there lived there in relative poverty, but also they maybe were cutting down some trees for like collecting firewood or something, but not like massive deforestation. They kind of made the problem much bigger than it actually was. And then a third one, which was for me like one of the most shocking ones, was that the same business guy who had the company in the tax haven and who promised the money for the communities, he also promised to protect these elephants and the lions. But then after we published our stories, we got like emails from hunting companies in the area. And they were like, wait, did this guy make 100 million with this project? We are collaborating with this entrepreneur on the hunting. So he was actually earning money with trophy hunting. It was like double dipping, right? He was making money with protecting the animals and shooting them.
Really absurd.
And this is this is a project that was in the sustainability reports of Gucci, Volkswagen, Prada, you name a company, a European multinational, and probably they were a client.
And we have talked about who carries the burden of the system, who profits from it.
Yeah, that's basically, I think, the project developers, when they are selling a lot of carbon credits, they get a lot of money. That's one benefiter. Then I think the people in between, like the traders, who get like a lot of money from it. And then you also have like the verifiers, who I think are getting less rich maybe from it, but still have like this financial incentive to just keep on existing. Yeah, and then I think last but not least, big clients like Shell and Chevron and like those type of companies, because they can keep on polluting as much as they actually want and still have the story that they compensated and pay less money for those compensations.
And when we say a lot of money, what kind of sums are we talking about? Like, how big is this market?
Yeah, so like because it's a private market, there's no like one single number that kind of really shows how big the market is, because some transactions are also not being registered. But let's just say that there's this platform ecosystem marketplace, and they do this annual estimations. And they, I think, estimated in 2021 the market was at its biggest of around 2 billion. And this is one at the time, a few years after Greta Thunberg, that all these companies were like suddenly having climate goals and climate targets, and we're taking immediate action with offsetting their emissions. And then, of course, more and more critique came, not just from us, but also from The Guardian and later also The New Yorker. And this market started to get a lot of critique, and therefore companies were more hesitant to offset their emissions. So since then, it has been decreasing from basically 2 billion to less than a billion, a bit between like half a billion to a billion, I would say.
Who should I be thinking about in terms of what kind of people became really rich from this market? Are these people that are like idealists who want to see a better world, or were they people that were just really looking to make money?
It's like in our book, we talk about the financial district in Amsterdam, because like Amsterdam became one of the global capitals of carbon trading. And there were people like 20 years ago who already saw that the EU and like the UN, they were starting with carbon pricing and with like even carbon credits as a mechanism. And they saw a big opportunity there to start to source kind of these carbon credits from everywhere across the globe, and then resell them basically to clients. So basically connecting the supplier and the buyer with them. So basically typical trader behavior. Then these people were also the ones becoming rich of it, because they were the only ones who really knew, who had the best kind of information position, because they knew how much the seller would sell it for, and they knew how much a buyer would want to buy it for. So we saw like insane margins of like buying carbon credits for 50 cents and selling them for more than 20 euros, right? I mean, if you do this well and on a big scale with like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of credits, then you can make pretty good money.
So I was wondering, with the situation slowly changing, renewable energy is getting much cheaper than other forms of electricity generation, at least. So I was wondering how that changes the situation. Do we still need carbon credits when the market already kind of incentivizes clean energy?
According to the European Union, we do. In Paris in 2015, we all agreed on certain climate goals. And now the European Union is sort of hinting at the fact that it will not work. They're saying maybe it's a bit more complicated than we initially thought. So maybe we need flexibility. And that's kind of what we've been seeing all these like 30 years of carbon trading. Flexibility is like this magic word that if you don't really want to do a lot to cut emissions, you can introduce it. And you can, in general, flexibility also means carbon credits. And in this case, it's also carbon credits. So the European Commission has decided that from 2036 onwards, we can start to use carbon credits to reach the climate goals that we actually needed to reach without them.
But if you and other journalists have time and time again pointed out that these carbon credit projects very often do not work, how is it possible that it's actually still being used, but in fact even being more and more integrated into climate policy?
The idea is that every time it's a different type of credit. So what we also see happening a lot is that every few years there's better credits, there's higher integrity credits, you name it. There's always like this like idea of, but now it will happen, now it's going to work. And I mean, I'm not saying it's never going to work. We cannot predict the future. Maybe at a certain point there will be a system that is flawless, but we're not there yet. And I think it's all coming down to the basic idea that you cannot compensate something that is for sure. So you will emit for sure. You will have these emissions with something that is very unsure, like the potential of maybe like taking this CO2 out of the air or maybe avoiding a certain amount of CO2. So I think that will always be the case. So to say like it compensates something like perfectly, I think is very, very hard to do.
So basically, is your observation that what we're really doing here, that we're sort of developing this dependency on this concept of flexibility to reach our climate goals?
Yes, I think we're believing all in the promise and the good intentions of the industry, which we also started with and that we really fell for. And that's just, it's like too good to be true, right? So I think we're just being, it's an easy, convenient fairy tale to believe in. That's what it comes down to. And that kind of helps you to avoid you as a society. So I'm really talking about a societal level. It's not individual responsibility that I'm talking here about, but like really societal pressure to kind of change our the way our economy functions, and in a way like change our industries and transition towards much more sustainable alternatives.
And in the beginning, you mentioned something about the carbon credit system being better than nothing. After doing all this research for years, is that a feeling that you have that, okay, at least it's better than nothing?
I think the system as it is now is actually undermining climate ambition because it offers this easy way out and quick fix. But I do think that project developers that have the good intentions, that want to restore nature, protect certain species, we need more of that. And I just think the business model behind it shouldn't be I'm legitimizing nature destruction or pollution elsewhere. It's just we need more nature restoration. And if you see this balance in the UN Environmental Program report, 30 times destruction to one-time restoration. I mean, this is balance we need to get in order. And we don't do that by multiplying the money we give to nature restoration by 30 times. That's unrealistic. So we really need to reduce the way we impact our environment and climate.
All right. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tisa and Mira. And
Thank
Alex
you
and
for
I will be
having us.
back soon for another episode. Thank you. You've listened to the podcast of Follow the Money. Our watchdog journalism is funded by our members. Subscribe and support European investigative journalism.